Hello and welcome to another Human Synergistics webinar. My name is John Van Etten, and I'm very happy to join you today to talk about the topic of leadership and management impact tools and how we unlock and get the most out of their reports. So thank you very much for joining me today. If you're joining live, please feel free to add comments or questions in the chat. Be happy to take those as we move ahead. As always, we'll be recording this session, so it will be posted on our website. So if you'd like to refer to that later for your reference, happy to make that available. So let's jump into it. Today, we're talking about getting the most out of leadership and management impact reports. This session will assume that you have some familiarity with these instruments, as we'll be focusing on really the high-level best practices as we move through the reports. If you're not familiar with the impact tools or you have any questions about them, please feel free to reach out. What we'll be looking at today is a real report from a leadership team who used the leadership impact instrument, and we're looking at a composite version of the PDF report. So this is a leadership impact report. Again, this is 8 leaders who have used the instrument. If you're familiar with the tool, you know that you'll not only get a report for each individual leader or manager, but there's also the opportunity to generate a composite report where we essentially pull all of the leaders' data from, for example, a specific team together and create essentially a team composite profile and results. I've done other sessions on the benefits of utilizing composite reports, so please have a look on our website in the video section for best practices for composites. I find them to be tremendously helpful, especially for initial debriefs with leadership teams. So I think this will be a good example of how we go through reports and what the key messages are to focus on. I've done a few other videos on the topic of how to get the most out of Human Synergistics reports across other tools like GSI and LSI. So this one also shares some of those themes, particularly the fact that I always say, before we get into the reports, we need to be clear on why we're using these instruments, what the actual purpose of this development is. And secondarily, we need to be clear on what the leadership impact tool does, what it actually measures, and what it is telling us, so that as we get into the report, we understand what this is all about. All right, so we'll step in, have our cover page, and I'll just jump ahead a few pages to the high-level model. So this is the leadership impact and management impact models. These are a 4-stage causal model, starting on the left-hand side with the ideal description in terms of what kind of behavior these leaders described as ideal and appropriate within their team. The second section there is strategies with respect to facilitating and inhibiting strategies. The third section is current actual impact, and the last section of the model is effectiveness. Again, this is core to the instrument and something that, if you're familiar with the tool, hopefully you're familiar with this model. I pointed out now just because we need to remember that as we move into the rest of the report, the data in the report will be provided to us in the opposite order of the model, meaning we will see outcome, effectiveness criteria first, then we will get current and ideal impact profiles, and then finally, at the end of the report, we will get the strategies. This is helpful and intended to facilitate the debriefing process as we discuss effectiveness and then begin to ask questions around why am I perceived the way that I am and what could we do differently. That naturally leads us causally backward in the model to the other various sections. So this is, again, the high level picture, and then we will begin stepping into each piece of this report. So as I mentioned, starting with the effectiveness sections, I realize this is a little too small to read. The point here is really just to reiterate what we're trying to get out of this and the key messages and takeaways. So these are performance criteria on which these leaders were ranked and described in terms of their effectiveness. So the leadership and management impact tools have multiple different areas of effectiveness that are assessed. And I think that's a very helpful place to begin a developmental conversation in terms of how are we performing currently? How are we perceived in terms of effectiveness as a leader individually, in this case with the composite, as a leadership team. Once we've sort of digested that feedback, as we think and move forward, then the opportunity is to not only recognize where we currently fall, if you will, in terms of effectiveness, but what we can do differently in the future to improve that kind of score. So this is the developmental nature of the instrument. So I guess you could argue that while we are assessing the effectiveness of these leaders or managers based on these criteria, the instrument, I would argue, is not simply an assessment. It is more than that in terms of a causal diagnostic instrument, so that we can not only assess how effective leaders are, but understand why that is, and moving forward, what specifically these leaders can do differently, ultimately to improve these scores. All right. And if you're familiar with the impact tools, then as I take the step forward into the profiles, hopefully this should of course make sense in terms of what we're looking at. The first profile that we receive is the current impact profile. So again, this is 8 leaders, their teams, and the combined feedback in terms of, again, the kinds of behavior that this leadership team is currently encouraging, facilitating, in their team. So the current behavioral impact. So quite an impressive thing, I think, to measure when we think about topics related to this, like organizational culture, being able to measure the behavior that leaders, and in this case, a leadership team, are directly encouraging, facilitating, and enabling in the business is very powerful to understand how the culture is being shaped, and moving forward, how we can shape that more intentionally and in a more focused direction. All right, if you're familiar with our models, then you're seeing a profile that is trending toward the norm in terms of the 50th percentile, which makes some sense given the composite nature of the report. However, we can see quite a bit of passive defensive green patterns playing out currently in terms of what these leaders are encouraging in their direct reports. And if you're familiar with those patterns, you may also recognize that that's not all an uncommon sort of impact for leaders to have. So again, this is current impact of this leadership team upon their direct reports. And a few pages later, after some basic statistics, we then give you the ideal description as described by these leaders. So again, very helpful aspect of the leadership and management impact tools is that we have an individual ideal description so that each leader and manager can really think and reflect for themselves and define and describe for themselves what kind of behavior I want and need essentially from my team. What is best practice? What do I want to see from them? And they get to define that for themselves. Again, that's something that is not coming from or dictated by human synergistics. It's not being dictated by consultants and coaches. It's defined by the leaders themselves based on their business, their challenges and situations, right? What do I need from my people? In any case, I've done another video on the value of ideal descriptions. So if this is interesting for you, I have more content on that, happy to share as well. But the point at this time is, I think it's very helpful to get clear and anchored around what do we really want? What is best practice here? What is good leadership? And get clear on that, especially when we can do that as a team, as we do in this case, so that we can really understand what we agree on and what is shared amongst our understandings of, again, what kind of behavior we need and what's really going to lead us forward. So the profile that we're seeing here on the screen is very constructive, as you can tell. And I would argue that that is based on over 50 years of research, quite a high performing kind of profile. So that is, in fact, the kind of behavior that enables teams and individuals to contribute productively, effectively, and collaborate cohesively with other team members. So this is a very positive description, and again, something that this leadership team can use as their own defined target, essentially. This is what we want to encourage within our teams and our people. And thankfully, now the tool is going to go that next step to help leaders to understand what are the differences between this ideal and current impact, just a few pages later. And then finally, we'll move into strategies to understand what these leaders can specifically focus on in order to shift that impact. All right, this is a page that most coaches and consultants will always say that leaders like to spend some time on. People are naturally curious about not only sort of how do we see ourselves, but how are we seen by others. And so this feedback of, in this case, on the left-hand side, the current impact that we are having as compared to our ideal is a very good place to continue the conversation around where are we right now in terms of our current state, and where are we going as a business, as an organization? What do we need more of moving forward? This is broken down in terms of the text and data, but as you can see from the profile, there are some similarities, particularly in the aggressive defensive patterns of these profiles. We can see that these leaders are in fact encouraging and creating very much what they would like to in that red quadrant of the profile. In other areas, particularly the passive defensive area, we're encouraging more of that behavior than we say we should. And secondarily, we are not encouraging as much constructive behavior as we said we would like to have. So looking at that in terms of a gap comparison, I think is tremendously helpful to help leaders not only understand culture and behavior and these kinds of patterns, but to gain clarity around moving forward. What do we need more of? What do I need to facilitate, encourage, role model, and so on? Very good. All right. So once we have a good discussion and grounding around the current impact versus the ideal, and start to get a little bit of direction in terms of what might we want to shift, for the sake of this example, I would suggest that really the first goal is to encourage more constructive patterns, blue, and the second goal might be to reduce some of those defensive, passive patterns, green, at least if we're taking this at face value in terms of the current impact and the ideal described by these leaders. So how we do that then moves us forward into another section of the report where we begin looking at the actual strategies used by leaders that are having this impact. So this report, by the way, composite is about, I think, 40 pages long. I'm just skipping through to really hit the highlights so that we can be crisp and clear in our messaging, and hopefully this will help to reinforce what pieces we really need to emphasize as we go through the report to help that learning process. There's a lot of information in here, but there are some key stepping stones that we need to make sure come across clearly. All right. So if we have the understanding that moving forward, again, we're hoping to encourage more constructive behavior in our people and teams and a little less of that passivity, then we need to look causally at what we as leaders are doing that is influencing that behavior. Again, if you're unfamiliar with the tools, accreditation might be something to be helpful to explain all of these terms and concepts. But if we're looking at what it is that leaders do that influence the behavior of their people, these are what we call strategies. And we measure those in a variety of different categories. And we also measure the extent to which those strategies are prescriptive or restrictive. And that's essentially what we're looking at here. Again, not to get diverted into accreditation content, but the basic pattern tends to be the prescriptive strategies. These are the blue bars that we're seeing on the screen, are responsible for and primarily drive constructive behavior in teams. If we use more prescriptive strategies, we tend to get more constructive behavior from our people and teams. Conversely, the use of restrictive strategies, and those are the red bars that we're seeing on the page, are related to the extent to which we find security-oriented behavior in teams, in this case, that passive defensive green behavior. So in very short terms, a bit oversimplified, but if we want more constructive behavior, we need as leaders to utilize more frequently prescriptive strategies and less frequently those restrictive red strategies. All right. If you're familiar with these instruments and are accredited, then you'll recognize that the thresholds that we're seeing on this screen are not sufficient to encourage particularly constructive behavior. Again, in the leadership impact, those thresholds are 3.0 for the prescriptive strategy frequency and negative 1.5 for the restrictive strategy frequency. So we are seeing that this leadership team is below the negative 1.5 restrictive threshold. So that is a positive to see. However, there is a large gap between the current use of prescriptive strategies and the 3.0 threshold that's really needed to encourage and facilitate the constructive behavior that we said we want to. Okay. So now that we have a bit of more direction in terms of what we need as leaders to do differently, we need to be a little more prescriptive in how we interact and fulfill our roles. Then let's get more specific about what that is. So a few pages later, then we begin to break this down across various responsibilities that leaders and managers carry out, how those are done both prescriptively and restrictively, and the frequencies with which this leadership team is not only fulfilling those responsibilities and strategies, but doing so in in prescriptive versus restrictive ways. By the way, we use slightly different terminology between the leadership impact and management impact, which is why I'm confusing myself. In the leadership impact, we refer to these things as being either prescriptive or restrictive, whereas in in the management impact, we refer to them as being either facilitating or inhibiting. But in any case, very similar in terms of their nature and effect and influence on those people whom we lead. So again, understanding what we're doing and what we're doing most frequently gives us specificity in terms of where we need to focus. Again, we recognized based on what we've been talking about that this leadership team would perhaps most benefit from using more frequent prescriptive blue strategies. And when we turn to this page and begin looking at some specifics, you can see that they're not using all of these strategies equally. There are certain areas where maybe we could really leverage and create some real development. I know it's a little too small to see, but if you see the screen on the upper right-hand side of the page, I believe that's referring. But in any case, that's a good example. We can see that the blue bars on that section of the report are a little bit lower, and that might be a nice opportunity for us to use more frequent prescriptive strategies. Now, how we do that, again, I typically, best practice, like to encourage leadership teams to identify one or two of these strategies that they will begin working on and developing. Again, the purpose of this is not to assess leadership effectiveness and current impact. It's to understand how that's actually happening, what we as leaders can do differently to create excellence, to drive even further growth. This isn't about good leaders and bad leaders. It's about learning and growing and becoming even more effective in leading my people towards goals, helping them to be collaborative and effective, and making sure that we're getting the best out of our people. And we get to define what that looks like in terms of the ideal impact, and we get to understand how we as leaders influence those patterns and what specifically we can do to drive the curiosity and innovation that organizations need today, right? What are the strategies I can use to do that, and how do I do that consistently? So then once we identify a few of these strategies that we as leaders feel that we can leverage and begin to focus on, then it makes sense to step into the details. So this is just graphically an example of one of these strategies. Again, we're breaking this down into detail in terms of the leader's perception, the feedback, and even the feedback broken out across various subgroups. But the point is here to get specific and clear on what is this strategy. I'll give you an example. One of these that we look at is frequency of positive versus negative feedback. So positive feedback being typically prescriptive in nature, negative feedback tending to be restrictive in nature. Both of these things are necessary. Both prescriptive and restrictive strategies must be used by leaders in organizations. But if we want people to be working in primarily constructive ways, then we need to use a certain balance or frequency of prescriptive to restrictive strategies. And that is actually what we're assessing here at this level of the tool. And at this page, this begins to get quite granular in terms of what these actions are that leaders are doing that is having the effect on their people and teams. And these begin to be the building blocks for a coaching and development initiative. Here are the things prescriptive that I'm going to commit to doing more frequently, more consistently with my team and people. And here are the things restrictive that I'm going to be a little careful about doing. I'm going to remind myself and recognize I can do those restrictive things, but I need to be consequential and a bit careful about how frequently I'm doing that in comparison to prescriptive strategies. All right. Getting a little technical here, I'll zoom back out, but hopefully this is showing that we can move through the report, staying at a fairly high level, hitting the really key messages and takeaways that leaders need to get from the report, and all the way down to the end here where we begin to get those action steps and tangible things that I can begin doing tomorrow with my people differently than I was today. And now I begin to have a different impact. These are fantastic developmental instruments. Not only do they create tremendous transparency in terms of how we as leaders influence our people and teams, what process that actually happens by, what the current impact is, what our ideal preferred state could be, and specifically those strategies that we need to do differently, more frequently, in order to enable and encourage that kind of behavior and excellence in our people and business. So like I said, I think the report has about 80 pages. So I always tell consultants, I don't think coaching really means going through all 80 pages of the report. It's really more about going through the key messages in the report, the story, if you will, that enables leaders to understand what this is telling me, why this is important, and at the end of the day, what I can do differently to begin having a more positive, more constructive, more productive impact on my people and teams. I hope that is helpful and interesting to you in terms of unlocking the secrets of the Leadership Impact Report. To be honest with you, I think that also actually covers management impact as well. If you're not familiar with the tools, they really are quite similar in their structure. We're measuring a bit of different things between leaders and managers, but when we're thinking about the model and the debriefing process, those things tend to be extremely similar. So you can take what I've described in terms of that storyline and apply that just as easily to the management impact reports and content as you can to leadership impact. Again, keeping that high level storyline, moving us through causation. Be careful of trying to debrief the entire report at once. There's a lot of content there. There are a lot of new concepts that leaders might not be familiar with, prescriptive, restrictive, these circumplex profiles and so on. I find it to be very helpful, and you'll see this if you're accredited in all of our coaching outlines and workbooks, that it's helpful to break this down into a step-by-step process where we're debriefing, for example, the effectiveness criteria first, thinking about that, reflecting on that, deciding if we're happy with that or not, and if not, what would we wish were different? And then we can begin stepping into, well, why is that happening? Why are we seen that way? What is the impact that we're currently having? Is that what we want to be encouraging? Let's look. all of the questions that I think leadership teams have in terms of how they encourage their people, drive culture, is really within this report. But I find that people almost get more out of it when they break it into one piece at a time and make sure that that is a consistent and clear learning journey for your leaders and organization. All right. I think that is the high-level pieces that I wanted to communicate for you today. I hope that's helpful in terms of what you're looking at and where to find things in the report, and again, how that creates hopefully a consistent story and learning journey for your leaders. If you have any questions about the leadership impact tools, or there's anything that we Human Synergistics can help you with, please feel free to reach out anytime. Thank you so much for your time today. Bye-bye.